There is a photograph. It was taken in 1862 in a modest studio in Boston, Massachusetts. In it, a man sits alone in a chair, stiffly posed, the way everyone posed back then, when the exposure took long enough that moving meant becoming a blur. Except this man is not entirely alone. Behind him, barely visible, soft and luminous as smoke, stands a second figure. The figure has a face that several witnesses identified without hesitation as a dead man, a man who had been buried for 2 years. And this photograph was not dismissed as a curiosity. It was reproduced, it was circulated, it was testified about in a court of law. And the man behind the camera, a Boston engraver named William Mumler, became famous overnight, not in spite of the impossibility, because of it. Now here is the question I want you to sit with before we go any further. When does a ghost story stop being a ghost story and start being something else entirely? When does a shared illusion become a mechanism? When does manufactured fear stop being entertainment and start being policy? Welcome to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and today we are going somewhere uncomfortable. We are going into the dark machinery of the Victorian press, the age of the penny paper and the penny dreadful, the age when a single printed lie could empty a city block before sunrise. We are going to follow the pattern from the Great Moon Hoax of 1835 to the Cardiff Giant of 1869 to the phantom known as Spring-Heeled Jack, all the way to a scientific forgery that occupied the brightest minds in England for 41 years. And we are going to ask the question that the official history politely avoids. What if some of these manufactured panics were not accidents at all? If that already sounds like something you want to stay for, do me one favor right now and subscribe to this channel. Not because I am asking for numbers. Because the next episode I am building is going to go even deeper into one of the most disturbing cases in this entire series. And if you are not subscribed, the algorithm will not tell you when it lands. Hit the button. Come back for that one. And one more thing before we begin. Somewhere in this episode, I'm going to tell you about a specific piece of legislation, a real law, quietly changed in the aftermath of the most successful media panic of the 19th century. A law that expanded police powers in ways that had nothing to do with the monster on the front page. I will tell you when we get there, but I want you to already be thinking about that. Hold it in the back of your mind. And now, let us go back to the beginning. The architecture of belief. To understand what happened with the Victorian press, you have to understand what the press actually was in 1835. It was not the institution we imagine when we think of journalism. It was barely an institution at all. In England, the government had spent decades trying to strangle it. Since the early part of the century, newspapers were subject to a stamp duty, a tax per printed sheet, that kept the cover price so high that most working-class people could not afford one. Historians of 19th century media have noted that this tax was widely called the tax on knowledge by radicals who opposed it, and with good reason. The price of a single newspaper was often more than a laborer earned in a full day of work. So what happened instead was something remarkable. Communities gathered in coffee houses and public reading rooms, and one person would read the newspaper aloud to everyone else, which means that printed words had a secondary life as spoken performance, which means that headlines were designed not only to be read, but to be heard, to be dramatic, to fill a room. The architecture of Victorian sensationalism was built on the acoustics of a reading room. Across the Atlantic in New York City, something equally important was taking shape: the penny press. A new kind of newspaper that cost 1 cent, made its money from advertisers rather than subscribers, and therefore needed one thing above all else: enormous circulation numbers. Benjamin Day launched the New York Sun in 1833 on this model, and within 2 years it had become something that could not have been imagined before: a mass media product aimed at everyone, not just the wealthy few. The logic of the penny press was not about informing the public, it was about capturing the public, holding attention long enough to sell advertisements. That is not cynicism on my part. That is the commercial reality of the model as understood at the time. And within that logic, a slow news day was an existential crisis. What you do with a slow news day, when your revenue depends on people buying your paper, is you fill it with something that is not slow. And this is where one of the most astonishing media events of the 19th century was born. On the 25th of August, 1835, the New York Sun published the first in a series of 6 articles under a magnificent headline, Great Astronomical Discoveries Lately Made by Sir John Herschel. The articles claimed to be reprinted from the Edinburgh Journal of Science. They were attributed to a Dr. Andrew Grant, described as a colleague of Herschel, who was at that moment running a real telescope in South Africa. And what they described was, by any measure, one of the most audacious fabrications in the history of print. Sir John Herschel, according to these articles, had discovered life on the moon. Not simple life. Civilization. His new telescope, the pieces claimed, had revealed miniature bison roaming the lunar surface, 2-legged beavers that used fire, lush vegetation, rivers, and perhaps most strikingly, a species of winged humanoid resembling a bat, with semi-transparent membrane wings and what the author described as human-like features, living in apparent harmony in the craters of the moon. What do you think happened? What do you think the readers of New York City, people who had grown up reading accounts of the great naturalists and explorers, people primed by decades of earnest speculation about whether the moon was inhabited, actually believed when they read these words? The answer is that a very large number of them believed it was true. A committee of scientists from Yale University, according to multiple contemporary accounts, actually traveled to New York to try to locate the original Edinburgh Journal articles. The New York Times, at the time a rival paper, called the discoveries probable and possible. Religious groups reportedly began discussing the prospect of missionary work on the moon. As Edgar Allan Poe, one of the earliest skeptics, wrote in a letter that has been preserved, not 1 person in 10 discredited it. The author of these 6 articles was a reporter named Richard Adams Locke, and his motivation, accounts suggest, was primarily satirical. Some historians who have studied the penny press era argue that Locke intended to parody earlier earnest speculations about lunar life, particularly the works of a popular science writer named the Reverend Thomas Dick, who had written best-selling books claiming the moon alone held 4.2 billion inhabitants. The hoax, in other words, may have started as mockery of credulity. It just turned out that the thing it was mocking was more powerful than the mockery. On the 16th of September, 1835, the Sun admitted the articles had been a fabrication. And here is the detail that matters most. People were not outraged. They were, by most accounts, amused. Sales of the paper did not suffer. The Sun continued publishing for over a century after the Great Moon Hoax, finally ceasing only in 1950. And Richard Adams Locke was credited by the editor of a rival publication, James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald, with inventing what he called a new species of writing. The scientific novel passed off as news. That phrase deserves to stay with us. Because what Locke had demonstrated was not just that people would believe something false. He had demonstrated that the emotional and psychological machinery of belief could be activated deliberately by identifying what people already wanted to believe and feeding it in detail with the authority of a scientific or official voice. That lesson was not lost, and it was not applied only to matters of entertainment. The monster in the street. 3 years after the moon hoax, on the 9th of January, 1838, the most respectable newspaper in England, the Times of London, published a letter. The letter had been forwarded from the office of Sir John Cowan, the Lord Mayor of London, who had received it anonymously from a writer identifying themselves only as a resident of Peckham. The letter described something that had been circulating as rumor through the working-class southern districts of the city for months. A figure, a being that could leap over walls 9 feet high, that breathed fire, that had eyes like burning coals and claws of metal, that had terrified at least one young woman badly enough that she suffered what was described in the letter as a dangerous fit. The Times printed the letter. And that act, the printing of an anonymous letter describing a monster, was the moment a local rumor became a national panic. Within days, more letters arrived. More witnesses came forward. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. The figure acquired a name: Spring-Heeled Jack. The first detailed published account of a physical attack by this entity appeared in February of 1838, and it involved an 18-year-old girl named Jane Alsop of Bearbinder Lane, Bow, on the eastern edges of London. Her account, which she gave to magistrates and which was subsequently reprinted in newspapers, including the Staffordshire Advertiser, described a man in a large cloak who knocked at her gate, claiming to be a police officer who had captured Spring-Heeled Jack in the lane nearby. When she came outside with a candle, she reported that the figure threw off the cloak and attacked her. She described him as wearing a tight-fitting suit of white oilskin, a helmet, and claws of some metallic substance. She stated that he breathed blue and white flame from his mouth. She stated that his eyes resembled red balls of fire. Her father and sister came to her aid, and the figure fled. Her injuries were real. The account was corroborated. And the press treatment of this story is where things become genuinely strange, because the press did not treat it as a crime story. They treated it as something closer to a supernatural visitation. The name Spring-Heeled Jack had already appeared in the West Kent Guardian on the 13th of January, 1838, in connection with a separate incident, and the Times itself coined that specific spelling of the name on the 22nd of February, the same day it covered the Alsop attack. A monster was being assembled, named and distributed by the press in real time. Now, here is what actually happened in the streets of London in response. The Lord Mayor, Sir John Cowan, held a public session at the Mansion House and formally acknowledged the complaints. He offered a £10 reward, the equivalent of several £100 today by most estimates, for information leading to the capture of the perpetrator. Additional police night patrols were deployed in the affected neighborhoods. Vigilante groups formed in working-class districts, men patrolling the streets at night hoping to catch Jack. The Metropolitan Police, relatively newly formed as an institution, having been established only in 1829, was under public pressure to respond to a creature that may not have existed. And that is the question that the historical record still cannot fully resolve. What was Spring-Heeled Jack? Historians who have studied the phenomenon, including folklorist David Clark in his detailed examination of what he calls a ghost panic, have argued that the sightings fit the pattern of collective hysteria amplified by media saturation. An analysis of over 45,000 words from period newspapers shows how isolated incidents in late 1837 snowballed into citywide fear. What began as scattered rumors of a leaping prankster in Lambeth and Barnes became, through the alchemy of print, a national terror. The most frequently named suspect, the figure that multiple contemporaries pointed to privately, even if they could not say so publicly, was Henry Beresford, the 3rd Marquess of Waterford, a man of genuinely spectacular recklessness, notorious for drunken escapades and deliberate cruelty as public entertainment. The theory was that Beresford and a circle of aristocratic associates, equipped with theatrical pyrotechnics and possibly spring-loaded boots of the kind used in circus performances, had decided to terrorize the working poor for amusement and perhaps a wager. Notably, the sightings did dry up significantly after Beresford returned to Ireland around 1842 and died in 1859. But accounts differ on whether any single person could explain all the incidents, and the record is unclear enough that no definitive conclusion has ever been reached. What is clear is that within weeks of the story breaking in the Times, it had spread to the whole of England. By April of 1838, Jack was being reported in Sussex. In May, a 14-year-old was frightened in Surrey. A peculiar report in the Brighton Gazette, reprinted in the Times in April of that year, described an incident in Rose Hill, Sussex, involving a figure appearing to a gardener in the shape of a bear or some other four-footed animal, climbing the garden wall and chasing the man. The Times reported this under the line that Spring-Heeled Jack had found his way to the Sussex coast, even though the description bore almost no resemblance to the London accounts. The monster was now a category, something to attach to any unusual fear, a template for local anxieties that had nothing to do with the original reports. By 1840, Spring-Heeled Jack had entered popular fiction. By the 1860s, he was the protagonist of his own penny dreadful series, Spring-Heeled Jack, the Terror of London, where he had been transformed from a villain into a costumed avenger. The monster made the leap from news to narrative so quickly and so completely that distinguishing one from the other became genuinely difficult. And that blurring of news and fiction, that transformation of a manufactured panic into cultural mythology, is a pattern we will see again and again in this story. What do you think is really going on here? Does the simplest explanation satisfy you, that this was just a prankster, some aristocratic fool with spring-loaded boots, amplified by a credulous press? Or does this feel like something stranger, something more deliberate? Tell me in the comments, because the next case I am going to describe should complicate your answer considerably. The Giant in the Ground. In the autumn of 1869, a 10-foot-tall stone man was pulled from the earth on a farm in Cardiff, New York, and within days, thousands of people were paying 50 cents each to stand in a tent and look at it. This is not a legend. This is documented in newspapers across the American Northeast from October of that year, in the business records of the men who profited from it, and in the court testimony that followed its unmasking. The Cardiff Giant was, by the measure of its time, the most successful archaeological hoax in the history of the United States. The story of how it got there is, in a strange way, both entirely ridiculous and philosophically quite serious. A New York tobacconist named George Hull, an atheist who greatly admired science, got into an argument in Iowa in 1866 with a Methodist revivalist preacher named Reverend Turk over whether the Bible should be read literally. Turk and his supporters cited Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, which states that there were giants in the earth in those days, and insisted it should be taken as historical fact. Hull, who lost the argument by virtue of being outnumbered at a revival meeting, reportedly had the germ of an idea before he was out of Iowa. He later said that he thought of making a stone and passing it off as a petrified man as soon as the argument was over. What followed was almost 2 years of meticulous planning. Hull traveled to Fort Dodge, Iowa, where he arranged for the quarrying of a 5-ton block of gypsum, a soft stone that could be carved but would plausibly resemble petrified flesh. He shipped it by rail to Chicago. There he hired a pair of sculptors, Frederick Morman and Henry Salleh, who worked from Hull's own body as a reference, Hull reportedly posing naked and supine as the model. The figure they produced was roughly 10 feet and 5 inches in length and weighed approximately 3,000 pounds. After initial carving, the team used needles to create the appearance of skin pores, rubbed the surface with sand and water to simulate erosion, and then poured both ink and sulfuric acid over the stone to age it. An attempt was made to create carved ringlets of hair, but when a local geographer consulted by Hull confirmed that hair did not fossilize, the hair was removed. Hull spent roughly $2,600 on the project, equivalent to over $60,000 by modern equivalence measures. He then arranged with his cousin William Newell, a farmer in Cardiff, New York, to bury the figure on Newell's property under roots to give the impression of long burial. On a night in late November of 1868, the 3,000-pound stone man was lowered into a hole 3 feet deep behind Newell's barn and covered over. And then Hull went home and waited nearly a year. On the 16th of October, 1869, Newell hired 2 workers, Gideon Emmons and Henry Nichols, to dig what he claimed was a well. Their shovels hit something hard at 3 feet down. Within hours, the farm had visitors. By the next day, Newell had erected a tent over the figure and was charging admission. By the end of the first week, the site had been nicknamed Giantville. The number of visitors reached several hundred per day. A syndicate of businessmen led by a showman named David Hannum paid $37,500 for the figure, a sum that translates to something close to $500,000 by current measures. They took it on tour through Syracuse and Albany. Now here is where the press enters, and where the story becomes something more than a simple con. The New York State geologist, James Hall, a figure of genuine national reputation, publicly called the giant the most remarkable archaeological discovery ever made in this country. A professor from Rochester University, Henry Ward, initially supported its authenticity. Newspapers across the country covered the find with a level of seriousness normally reserved for actual scientific discoveries. The November 3, 1869 edition of the Worcester Daily Spy included testimony from Hall, describing the figure as a unique object related to the race or people formerly inhabiting that part of the country. The debate between what contemporaries called the petrifactionists, those who believed it was a genuine petrified man, and the statue theorists who thought it might be an ancient carved monument, actually helped prolong the hoax. Both interpretations treated the figure as genuinely ancient. The question of fraud was not seriously entertained in mainstream newspaper coverage for weeks. And meanwhile, the money kept coming in. The giant even received a small number of write-in votes for local political offices in Syracuse in November of that year, according to a contemporary note in what is now at the Farmers Museum at Cooperstown, New York, where the figure permanently resides. P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman of the age, made an offer of $60,000 for a 3-month lease of the giant. When Hannum refused, Barnum commissioned an exact plaster copy and put it on display in his museum in New York City, claiming that his copy was the original and the Cardiff specimen the fake. This second-order hoax drew larger crowds than the first, and when Hannum sued Barnum, the presiding judge reportedly told him that he would need to bring the giant himself into court to swear to his own genuineness before any injunction could be issued. The legal absurdity of a lawsuit over competing fake giants became its own news story. Yale paleontologist Othniel C. Marsh, one of the country's most respected authorities, declared the figure one of very recent origin and a decided humbug. Professor O.C. Marsh had noted that the chisel marks on the stone were still plainly visible, and pointed out that gypsum would not have survived the wet soil conditions of Newell's farm if it had genuinely been buried for centuries. A November letter from Professor O.C. Marsh, dated the 24th of that month in 1869, concluded that the work was well calculated to impose upon the general public, and expressed surprise that any scientific observers should not have at once detected the evidence against its antiquity. This letter is held in the records of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Hull confessed on the 10th of December, 1869. He did so not reluctantly, but with evident satisfaction, stating publicly that his intention had always been to expose the tendency to believe in things too easily, and that he had never planned to conceal the hoax permanently. By early 1870, the court had declared both giants, the original and Barnum's copy, to be fakes. And yet the crowds kept coming. Visitors continued paying to see a figure that was officially, legally, undeniably, a piece of carved stone made in Chicago in 1868. People had started calling it Old Hoaxy, with what accounts describe as genuine affection. What does that tell you? That the exposure of a lie does not necessarily destroy its power. That the object of belief can survive the death of the belief itself, transformed into something else, a curiosity, a piece of cultural identity, a shared joke that somehow still draws a crowd. And what does it tell you about the scientists who endorsed it, the newspapers that amplified it, the businessmen who monetized it? What does it tell you about a society that could look at a piece of stone and collectively choose to see a petrified giant because that answer was somehow more satisfying than the truth? If you are still with me, I want to ask you to do one more thing. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We are building something here, episode by episode, a map of how manufactured reality has been working on human populations for much longer than most people realize. Each episode is a piece of that map. And the episode coming after this one involves a pattern so specific and so repeated that I genuinely do not know what to call it other than a system. The camera as oracle. In 1840, an Australian journalist, writing about the newly announced daguerreotype process, described photography as more like some marvel of a fairy tale or delusion of necromancy than a practical reality. That line has been quoted in several histories of Victorian photography, and I think it is worth sitting with. Because what this journalist was saying, just 1 year after photography was invented, was that the technology felt impossible, that it felt like magic. And if it felt like magic to a journalist, imagine what it felt like to an ordinary person in Boston or London who had never seen a photograph before, who had never held one, who stood in front of a camera for the first time and waited for the machine to do something that no human hand could do. Capture a moment, freeze a face, reproduce reality. The trouble with a technology that seems like magic is that it is very difficult to set limits on what you think it can do. And in the case of photography, that difficulty had consequences that no one had anticipated and that some people moved very quickly to exploit. In 1862, a Boston jewelry engraver and amateur photographer named William H. Mumler was developing a series of self-portraits in his studio. When he examined one of them, he noticed something in the image that he had not expected. A second figure, faint and translucent, standing near him. He had been alone in the studio. His initial instinct, according to his own account, was that he had accidentally reused a glass photographic plate that had not been cleaned, creating an overlap of two separate exposures. An entirely ordinary technical explanation. But before he could settle on that interpretation, he consulted a prominent advocate of the spiritualist movement who told him that he had photographed a ghost. Spiritualism in the 1860s was not a fringe belief. It had begun in 1848 in Rochester, New York, with two sisters named Maggie and Kate Fox, who claimed to be able to communicate with the spirits of the dead through a system of knocks and raps. The movement they ignited had spread across the United States and into Britain with remarkable speed, counting among its followers not just the grieving poor, but prominent scientists, journalists, and intellectuals. In 1888, Maggie Fox would stand on a stage and publicly confess that the whole system had been a fraud, that the knocking sounds were produced by cracking her toe joints, and that spiritualism was, in her words, a fraud from beginning to end. But in 1862, spiritualism was at its cultural height, fueled in part by the enormous death toll of the American Civil War. The country was full of grief, and grief is perhaps the single most powerful emotional state for the suspension of critical judgment. Mumler understood this, consciously or not. He began offering photographic sessions to people who wanted to see their dead relatives, and his business grew quickly. His photographs typically showed the living sitter in sharp focus and a second, blurry, translucent figure standing nearby, a figure that the sitter was invited to identify. One of Mumler's most famous works purportedly shows Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of the assassinated president, with a ghostly figure standing behind her that has been identified by some as Abraham Lincoln himself. This photograph is now held in various museum collections and remains one of the most widely reproduced images in the history of American photography. The techniques Mumler used, and which were subsequently identified and catalogued by expert witnesses at his fraud trial in 1869, involved at minimum double exposure and the careful selection of blurry partial images that could plausibly resemble whomever the customer most wanted to see. Since the mid-19th century was a time when very few people had access to photographs of their deceased relatives, there was almost no basis for comparison. If a bereaved mother came to Mumler's studio and a faint figure appeared behind her that had roughly the right hair color and height, the emotional pull toward identification was enormous. At his trial in New York in 1869, 9 separate methods for faking spirit photographs were identified by expert witnesses. And here is the remarkable detail. Mumler was acquitted. The prosecution could not prove to the court's satisfaction that he had used trickery as opposed to genuinely capturing something unusual on camera. The judge, working with the standards of evidence of 1869, could not draw a clean line between deliberate fraud and unexplained photographic anomaly. Because the technology itself was still so new, so incompletely understood even by the experts, that the very concept of what a photograph could and could not show was still being negotiated. In Britain, the story followed a similar arc. A photographer named Frederick Hudson operated a spirit photography studio in London in the 1870s, producing images that were questioned by critics but visited by believers. A later operator, William Hope, led what became known as the Crew Circle, producing photographs of sitters with ghostly presences until 1922, when investigators from the Society for Psychical Research, using glass plates secretly marked with X-ray signatures, demonstrated that Hope was substituting different plates than the ones he had been given. The returned plates with the spirit images had no markings. The conclusion was unambiguous. And yet Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, one of the most famous rationalists in English culture, refused to accept the evidence, calling the investigation a conspiracy against Hope. This is a pattern worth naming. In case after case across the Victorian era, the exposure of a specific fraud did not produce general skepticism about the category of claims the fraud represented. People who wanted the photographs to be real found reasons to reject the evidence that they were not. This was not stupidity or naivety. It was grief and need, and the fundamental human capacity to protect a belief that organizes the world in a way we can bear. The Victorian press understood this, and some of its operators used it with extraordinary precision. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you think. Was the Victorian public more credulous than we are, or were they dealing with something that we have simply learned different names for? Because I genuinely want to know your answer before we get to the most disturbing case in this entire episode. The pattern behind the panic. There is a question that I have been building toward since the beginning of this episode, and it is time to ask it directly. The Great Moon Hoax of 1835. The spring-heeled Jack Panic of 1837 and 38, the Cardiff Giant sensation of 1869, spirit photography and its attendant moral hysteria through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These are the famous cases. The ones that are written about in popular histories as examples of Victorian credulity, of a simpler, less media-literate time. But look at the timing. Not of the hoaxes themselves, of what was happening in the world around them. The Great Moon Hoax was published in August of 1835. 3 months earlier, in May of that year, the first major wave of American banking failures had begun, a precursor to the full panic of 1837, one of the worst economic crises the young United States had faced. Unemployment was rising. Tensions between labor and capital in the newly industrializing cities were sharpening. The penny press had just emerged, a new and not yet fully trusted medium, and it needed to demonstrate its power to attract and hold mass attention. The spring-heeled Jack Panic broke in London in the winter of 1837 and 1838. Queen Victoria had just come to the throne in June of 1837. The Metropolitan Police were barely 8 years old. London was in the middle of rapid industrial transformation, with hundreds of thousands of rural migrants flooding into the city, straining housing, employment, and public order. The Chartist movement, which would mount one of the most serious challenges to the established political order in the century, was organizing. The government was watching the streets. And then a monster appeared in the streets, and the government deployed police to look for it. The Cardiff Giant arrived in October of 1869, just 4 years after the end of a civil war that had killed over 600,000 Americans, according to widely cited historical estimates, and had shattered the cultural and religious certainties of an entire country. The post-war period was a time of profound national disorientation, when questions about human origins, about the meaning of suffering, about the literal truth of Scripture were raw and urgent in a way they had never been before. Into that specific wound, a petrified biblical giant was inserted, and the wound accepted it. I am not suggesting, and I want to be clear about this, that every Victorian hoax was centrally coordinated or deliberately deployed as a political tool. The record does not support that conclusion, and I am not going to argue for it. What I am suggesting is that certain people understood how mass media panic worked, that there was a discernible logic to when and why specific types of manufactured fear were most effective, and that the results of that fear were not always commercially neutral. Sometimes they were politically useful, and sometimes what followed a panic in the press was a change in the laws. In the wake of the spring-heeled Jack panic, London saw an expansion of police night patrols and a public acceptance of increased surveillance of working-class neighborhoods that would have been deeply contested in a calmer political moment. The Lord Mayor's formal acknowledgment of the complaints and his offer of a reward created a framework in which police presence in poor districts was justified not as political control, but as protection from a monster. The monster, whether real or imagined, did the work of making the police welcome. We cannot confirm with certainty that anyone designed this outcome. The historical record is not that clear. What we can say is that the outcome was convenient, and that it was noted. The Victorian state was not slow to learn that fear, once ignited, could be directed. The story of the Illustrated Police News, which began publishing in England in the 1860s, is perhaps the clearest illustration of the system at full operation. This was a paper that a Pall Mall Gazette readership poll in 1886 reportedly named the worst newspaper in England. It was sensationalist to its foundations, specializing in crime, violence, and what we might now call monster stories. Luridly illustrated, aimed explicitly at the semi-literate working class. Its editor, at one point, defended it publicly by saying there was nothing to which any reasonable objection could be taken, which tells you a great deal about the editorial standards of the time. What the Illustrated Police News understood, and what scholars have since documented in academic work, including Christopher Casey's study in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, is that sensational crime coverage created a persistent public belief that violent crime was common and existentially threatening, even in periods when actual data showed violent crime to be rare. The Jack the Ripper murders of 1888 are the classic example. The Whitechapel killings were real and terrible. But the newspaper coverage described London as gripped by widespread violent crime and in need of drastic action, creating a perception of the city that bore almost no relation to what police statistics showed. Most police work in London at the time revolved around petty theft, not murder. The gap between reported reality and statistical reality was closing. It was closing because the press was filling it. And what fills a gap in public understanding is not neutral. It carries the priorities, the fears, and the interests of whoever controls the press. The longest lie. And now we come to the case I promised you at the beginning, the one that went further than any of the others, the one that entered not just newspapers and not just public consciousness, but the textbooks, the museum displays, the scientific literature, and the lesson plans of schools on both sides of the Atlantic. The lie that was 41 years in the making and another 41 years in the living. On the 18th of December, 1912, at a formal meeting of the Geological Society of London, a solicitor and amateur antiquarian named Charles Dawson and his associate Arthur Smith Woodward, keeper of geology at the British Museum, presented what they described as the discovery of a new species of early human. They called it Eoanthropus dawsoni, which translates approximately as Dawson's Dawn Man. We know it better by the name of the Sussex village where it was supposedly found, Piltdown Man. The material consisted of fragments of a human-like skull and a jaw that appeared to be from a primitive ape, along with several teeth, some stone tools, and fragments of fossilized animals. The bones had been stained dark reddish-brown, a color that suggested great age, consistent with the reddish gravel deposits in the quarry pit at Piltdown, where Dawson claimed to have found them. When assembled, the skull suggested a creature with a large, human-like brain but an ape-like jaw, exactly the configuration that evolutionary theory at the time predicted for a transitional form between ape and human. In other words, a missing link. The earliest Englishman. The advance publicity had been handled masterfully. The Manchester Guardian published an account before the Geological Society meeting that described the find in vivid terms, going well beyond the cautious and tentative language that Woodward himself would use when presenting to his scientific peers. The newspaper wove the discovery into a narrative of British national pride, positioning England as the origin point of early humanity at a moment when German scientists had been making significant claims about Heidelberg Man, and the international competition for fossil prestige was running high. The public and scientific response was enormous. Anatomist Arthur Keith, a Fellow of the Royal Society, endorsed the find enthusiastically, as reported in The Lancet. The Atlanta Georgian declared that natives of Great Britain could trace their ancestry further back than any other peoples on the face of the earth. Piltdown Man was featured in textbooks, reconstructed in museums, and cited in scientific papers. A memorial plaque was erected at the site. A painting by John Cook in 1915 showed a group of distinguished scientists gathered around the skull, with a portrait of Darwin visible on the wall behind them, a deliberate visual argument that Piltdown Man confirmed everything Darwin had predicted. And yet, from almost the beginning, something was wrong. Foreign scientists who requested access to the original bones to examine them in person were denied. They were given plaster casts instead. A French geologist named Marcelin Boule concluded as early as 1915 that the jaw was from an ape and the skull was from a modern human. An American scientist, Gerrit Smith Miller, wrote in 1915 that deliberate malice could hardly have been more successful than the hazards of deposition in so breaking the fossils as to give free scope to individual judgment. Franz Weidenreich, examining the remains in 1923, concluded they were composed of a modern human cranium and an orangutan jaw with filed-down teeth. There were, by any serious account, multiple competent scientists who suspected a fraud within a few years of the initial announcement. But the British scientific establishment held. The bones remained in a secure vault at the Museum of Natural History in London. Access continued to be restricted. Doubters were marginalized or simply not given the platform to make their case effectively. And in 1915, Dawson produced Piltdown Man II, a second set of fragments found at a separate site several miles from the first, which appeared to confirm the existence of the species. The second find silenced many of the remaining skeptics. If two locations had produced similar material, the argument for fraud became harder to sustain. It was not until 1953 that investigators at the University of Oxford, using the then-new technique of fluorine dating, established definitively that the Piltdown bones were not all the same age. Further analysis revealed the complete picture: a human skull, likely medieval in origin, an orangutan jaw with teeth filed to look more human and stained to match. The entire assemblage treated with chemicals and loaded with gravel internally to add the feel of a genuine fossil. Everything about Piltdown Man was fabricated. Every element had been deliberately constructed to deceive. 41 years had passed between announcement and exposure. An entire generation of scientists had worked from a false foundation. Textbooks had been written around a lie. A Royal Society open science paper published in 2016 using DNA analysis and CT scanning concluded that all the forgeries most likely originated from a single perpetrator. The most probable suspect, given access, opportunity, and the fact that nothing was ever found at the site when Dawson was not present, was Charles Dawson himself. Dawson died in 1916, so he faced no consequence. 20 or more other names have been proposed over the years, including Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and even Arthur Conan Doyle. None of those alternatives have survived sustained scrutiny. But here is the question that the official post-exposure narrative quietly sidesteps. It is not who did it. It is why it worked for so long, not why one man could manufacture a fake fossil. That part is not difficult to explain. But why did the British scientific establishment, one of the most rigorous and well-resourced in the world, refuse to allow independent examination of the evidence for 4 decades? Why were the scientists who expressed doubts marginalized rather than heard? What is the name for a system that responds to legitimate scientific skepticism not with open investigation, but with restricted access and institutional authority? The Manchester Guardian had framed Piltdown Man as a matter of national pride before the scientific community had even formally examined it. The press had created a cultural investment in the finding being true, and that investment made the costs of acknowledging doubt very high. Not for Dawson. He was already dead. For everyone else, for the institutions that had built their authority in part on endorsing the find, for the nation that had been told it was the cradle of humanity. The lie had become load-bearing. And this, I would argue, is the most important lesson of the Victorian age of hoaxes. It is not that people believed false things. Every era does that. It is that the machinery for making false things believable had been industrialized. The penny press had figured out how to manufacture credulity at scale. Spirit photography had demonstrated that a new technology, imperfectly understood, could be turned into an engine of deception with virtually no resistance. The Cardiff Giant had shown that institutional authority, a respected geologist's endorsement, a prestigious university professor's opinion, could be borrowed and spent in service of a lie. And Piltdown Man had brought all of these elements together into something that embedded itself in official science for nearly half a century. We are still pulling threads from that period. The question of how manufactured consensus is built, how it is maintained, how it is eventually dismantled, and who benefits from each of those stages is not a question that belongs only to the 19th century. It belongs to every era in which there is a press, an audience, and something that someone very badly needs the audience to believe. I want to leave you with that, and I genuinely want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me. Which of the cases in this episode feels to you like it still has something buried in it, something the official account has not quite reached? The Moon Hoax, Spring-Heeled Jack, the Cardiff Giant, Spirit Photography, or Piltdown Man? I read every comment, and the ones that push hardest are the ones that shape the next episode. Because there is a next episode. In it, we are going to look at the specific detail I mentioned at the opening, the law that changed quietly after one of these panics, the expansion of powers written into the books while everyone was still looking at the monster. That detail has been sitting in the archive for over 150 years, and almost nobody talks about it. If you want to be there when I do, subscribe to EPOCH RESET. I will see you in the next one.